Remember back to the Oklahoma City bombing, everyone rushed to judgment to think it was perhaps overseas-based terrorism. Now, while all the indicators are going in that direction, it'd probably be prudent to just focus on the rescue efforts today and also to ask ourselves, you know, how did this happen? And kind of break down the operation and show people that this was a very low-tech but high-concept operation on the part of the terrorists.
Well, describe that for us. What do you mean by that, high concept?
Well, what I mean by that is, you know, Americans tend to rely on high-tech. We look to high-tech to solve most of our problems. Terrorists don't have high-tech at their disposal to the degree that a government such as the United States has. But unfortunately, they have a lot of time. An operation such as this may have been years in the making. We don't know yet how this operation was able to go forward, but let's just, you know, break down the steps. I took a few notes on it. At some point, we all recognized that there was some intelligence failure, that, you know, we've got to do better. We've done good in the past. We've improved our ability to defeat terrorism, but we're not perfect yet. And this is an example of that, to be sure. But then what happened was, the question is, how did these people get some sort of weapon onto an airplane? You know, I'm sure the FAA and the Department of Transportation and all the airports from which these aircraft were launched this morning will be taking a really hard look at that, and I'm sure we'll see some changes in the future.
Not an airplane, Mr. Beatty. I mean, 4 aircraft. That's an awful lot in different locations.
Exactly. This is a highly sophisticated approach, you know, but it's not the first time we've seen that. We've seen foreign groups destroy 2 embassies within moments of each other a couple of years ago on the continent of Africa. So we know that our opponent is capable of this type of operation, and he demonstrated it today on our homeland. The interesting thing here, Joey, you didn't need to bring across hundreds of pounds of explosives across a border someplace to commandeer an airplane. Why did they choose these airplanes? They picked these wide-body airplanes. The fact that the World Trade Center was prepared to sustain a hit from a 707 was not a well-kept secret. They picked airplanes that were bigger than that. Also, they picked airplanes that took off from the East Coast, headed to the West Coast, that were big airplanes, full of fuel. They weren't interested in killing people on the airplanes. The airplane themselves became the bomb. And so they didn't need to bring explosives into the country. We don't know yet whether it was knives or handguns or whatever. But the next question in the step as we break down the operational acts in this attack is, how did these people get weapons onto the aircraft? And then from there, to continue it, the question is asked, what about a cockpit incursion? How is it that they were able to get into the cockpits of the aircraft, take over the controls? And as we know and have heard in the past, that there are transponder codes that pilots can send if an aircraft is hijacked. From what I understand, we didn't get some of that yet, so we have to assume that the cockpits were burst into rather quickly. And I heard Judy Woodruff and others earlier infer, and I join them in drawing the same inference, that it's highly doubtful that the pilots of these aircraft, the United Airlines pilots and the American Airline pilots, were at the controls of these aircraft when they impacted their targets. So we have got to assume and infer that people capable of flying the aircraft, and remember, these aircraft are on duty all over the world, these perpetrators no doubt rehearsed this operation, rehearsed breaking into the cockpit and other locations, that they were probably piloted to the target by people capable of flying a military or a jet aircraft.
Well, do you think, I mean, I have to interrupt you to ask, do you think that perhaps in looking at the possibility of terror threats, I mean, certainly terror threats have come to this country in the past, and I'm wondering if you think perhaps we were thinking too high concept. We thought of something more elaborate, and perhaps intelligence should have been focused on this kind of low-tech approach. I suppose hindsight is 2020, but...
I think there's a lot of good in what you're pointing out, Joey. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You know, we cannot just focus all our energies on weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, etc. We've all been talking about that, and hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on that in recent years. But this didn't use any weapon of mass destruction, and I'm afraid that the casualty tally could approach 5 figures. And that means that we've got to beat these people, not only high tech, but we've got to be high concept. It means we've got to work harder in planning than we have up to this point. And I know that we will. And if I could say a word about the people at the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon, we've had the privilege in my company to work to support both organizations. We've trained every security officer at both locations. They knew what they were up against. They knew that they were icons, American icons, that were likely to be targeted. Excuse me, it's been an emotional day, plus it's a little hot out here. Likely to be targeted. And they did their best, but they were only one part of a system, as we've just outlined. You know, Doug Karpiloff, the Director of Life Safety and Security for the World Trade Center, is probably one of the premier security people in our country. Doug was always afraid of a scenario where there was a mass casualty incident at the World Trade Center and hundreds of emergency vehicles would rush to the scene. They don't have the ability to check all those vehicles to make sure that they don't pose a threat. So we're yet to determine, we've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted, whether in fact there wasn't something else at the base of the towers that in fact were the coup de grace to bring them to the ground.
Mr. Beatty, we appreciate all of your insight. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave you. There are still further developments on this story. Jeffrey Beatty's company is involved in counterterrorism information, and he joined us this afternoon from Dallas. Now let's go back to New York for the latest information there, and Aaron Brown.
Joey, thank you. A couple of things. The president is en route back to Washington, we are now told. The president had started his day in Sarasota, Florida, then went to Shreveport, a military base outside Shreveport, then went to Nebraska, where the Strategic Air Command is located, and now he is making his way back to Washington. And we are told the president will address the nation at some point tonight. We do not know at what time, but of course, when it happens, we will carry that live as well. We're also getting reports that a second building in the complex of the Trade Center, and again, you have the two towers, but then you have a number of support buildings around it, that another of those buildings, we reported a bit ago on Building 7, we now report that there are problems in Building 5, and that may be collapsing as well, but at least there is fire there. There are enormous logistical problems. We just looked down what is 8th Avenue behind us here, which is normally at this time of the day packed with cars. This is rush hour, people trying to get out of the city. It is empty, and the city, in at least this part of the city, Manhattan, is shut down, which means that thousands of people who are trying to get home, trying to get to the suburbs, trying to get to Long Island, trying to get to New Jersey particularly, that's where those trains, what are called the PATH trains, come into New Jersey, from New Jersey rather, at the Trade Center. All of them stranded here. CNN's Richard Roth is down on the streets of New York and is talking to some of the people who I suspect are wondering when they will get home. Richard?
People that you would have seen in locations you were just examining. Many thousands of them are here right now on the west side of Manhattan trying to escape from New York. New York City is sending them to ferries that are taking them to New Jersey. New York City bridges, we're told, are open for pedestrians. The tunnels for trains to take the thousands here were closed. Many of these people stunned, shocked, silence. I mean, you've never heard so many New Yorkers so quiet in your life. And many of them just have to look over their shoulders to see what they escaped as these two towers were leveled. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani called it one of the most heinous acts in United States history. He says he fears that the death toll may be more than New York can bear. He asked all New Yorkers to say a prayer. He said a rescue effort was beginning, but as we were told by one official with the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, there is so much jet fuel, furniture, paper, everything still going on up in smoke. He didn't want to send in his people to begin any type of detailed rescue effort. There are reports of some people alive, many dead down there. Scores, hundreds of emergency vehicles with their sirens have been roaring down Manhattan's west side here to the scene, carrying federal security people, all kinds. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said that there are more than 1,000 people taken to what's known as Liberty State Park, the walking wounded, he called them, several hundred, 600 or so in New York City hospitals. And the mayor said that there are 170 hospitals that are up and running, and other buildings are helping out for support. U.S. jet fighters overhead, circling occasionally, people craning their necks, looking up in the sky. Everybody's got a memory, everybody's got a story here. I personally saw Trade Tower #1, where CNN's New York bureau used to be in the lobby 17, 18 years ago, come tumbling down, and I was part of a stampede as people just raced for their lives as the smoke came closer and closer to all of us. That was after Tower #2 had gone down. You couldn't even see what was left of it, if anything was standing, due to all of the smoke. Aaron.
Richard, just help orient me for a second. Tell me where you are in the city right now as you talk to us.
We're on approximately 33rd Street on the west side of Manhattan. The Hudson River is just behind our camera position here, and it is an orderly departure here. I mean, you can see for yourself. People are just, they left work early. They were ordered out. The city is on high alert, no flights, and people are headed to New Jersey. Many of them would be at the ferry at this time on a normal day. This is certainly not a very normal day in New York City.
It certainly is not, Richard. Thank you. It is, I don't know if remarkable is the right word, but it's worth noting again that in every picture that we have seen from the scene, the people who had just experienced the most horrendous imaginable thing were remarkably orderly and calm as they left the area. I don't want to suggest for a second that there wasn't any panic, that there wasn't any screaming. These are human beings, and human beings behave in a variety of ways. But every picture we have seen, New Yorkers calmly, if that's the right word, calmly left the scene, moved out of the area. No reports of trouble at all as firefighters and police personnel came down into the city. Scores, hundreds of civilians started to move out, and they are still calmly moving out. We suspect there is some sense of shock as they try and figure out what has happened to their city, what has happened to their lives, and perhaps most importantly, what has happened to their friends and their co-workers who may not have gotten out of those buildings today. One of the problems that the city is faced with is, and as Richard alluded to, is moving people around. You have essentially a shutdown going on here. In some of the outlying areas, city governments are trying to support the city as best they can. Tom Swayze is the mayor of Glen Cove out on Long Island. Tom, I think you're on the phone. Mr. Mayor, can you hear me?
Yes, this is Tom Swayze, mayor of the city of Glen Cove.
Tom, tell us what Glen Cove is doing to support the efforts going on here in Manhattan.
We have high-speed ferries that operate from Glen Cove to Pier 11 down by Wall Street. And we've already evacuated about 1,200 people with the help of Fox Navigation from New York City out here back to the island. We are now working at the request of Commissioner Carrick to try and bring emergency personnel, doctors, nurses, back into Manhattan to try and help relieve some of these doctors and nurses that are going to start getting very exhausted at the area hospitals down on the southern tip of Manhattan.
And is there a number people should call or a location they ought to go to if they are medical personnel and can help in the effort down there, where they can get on one of these ferries and come on down?
We'd like them to come to the end of Glen Cove Road, the northern end of Glen Cove Road in Glen Cove, to the parking lot across from our police station, the end of Glen Cove Road, across from the Glen Cove police station, where we will take them by bus down to the ferry terminal. If they want to call for information, they should call the ferry terminal itself at 609-3342, 609-3342. We're coordinating with the Nassau County and Suffolk County emergency management offices as well. But right now we need to get emergency-type personnel, doctors, nurses, EMTs. We know everybody wants to help, but we're not looking for just regular volunteers who mean well, and we appreciate their interest. We're looking for professionals who can go into Manhattan and be prepared to work.
Tom, thank you for joining us and for your efforts today. I apologize for mispronouncing your name a moment ago. Thank you. Judy in Washington.
Aaron, we're here in the Washington studio, and among others, I'm joined by former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, former Army General Haig. You were, of course, Secretary of State during the Ronald Reagan administration. And, Mr. Secretary, you were in that post at a time of a national emergency, the assassination attempt on the life of President Reagan. And what I want to specifically ask you about is, what is it like for the people on the inside, the heartbeat of government, when something horrific like this happens? Of course, this is a very different situation, but what is it like when you have to react to something?
Well, I think most people wait and look for direction. And so it's very important that they have it. If they don't, they sometimes sit in shocked inaction. And so you have to have that. And that's the critical aspect of moving through a crisis of this kind.
And we've heard from President Bush now at 3 different intervals today, when he was still in Florida, when he moved on to Louisiana, and then a statement when he was in Nebraska. Now we know he's back to Washington. Now let me ask you, he's coming back to the Washington area. We don't know where he's going to go. Vice President Cheney at an undisclosed location. The Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, at an undisclosed location. I'm not asking you to tell us where they are, but what would it be like in one of these locations where they were essentially kept away and kept safe?
Well, all of these installations have been established for precisely this reason. And that means that they're armed with communications, with living facilities, and that's the situation. Now, they don't exercise them all as regularly as I suppose we used to during the nuclear era, but they still exercise them, and they're very, very efficient facilities.
You're saying they don't exercise them, presumably because it's felt that the threat isn't as serious in the post-Cold War world?
Well, it's, you know, government is tough. And people are always responding to the crisis of the moment. Usually it's in the first headlines in the daily press.
The world's worst terrorist attack in the United States has hijacked planes slam into New York's World Trade Centers, razing the buildings, and a simultaneous attack on the Pentagon in Washington. Good morning. This is a special ABC News Bulletin. I'm Jane Hutchin. What's shaping as the worst terrorist attack in world history has taken place across the United States. Hundreds, possibly thousands of people have died in an apparently coordinated attack that has razed New York's World Trade Center and destroyed parts of the Pentagon in Washington. 3 commercial airliners were hijacked and crashed into both towers of the Trade Center and the Pentagon. A 4th plane inexplicably crashed in Pennsylvania around the same time. The U.S. National Security Council is meeting to plan a response, and all civilian air movements in the country have been suspended. Precise death tolls are not available, but American Airlines and United Airlines say there were a total of 266 people aboard the missing aircraft. The attacks have drawn condemnation from world leaders and sparked a huge security clampdown on U.S. facilities around the world. No one has yet claimed responsibility for the attacks. Up to 50,000 people normally work inside the World Trade Center in New York. Now it's just a smoking ruin.
Horror beyond description on a New York morning. First one plane crashes into a tower of the World Trade Center, then another.
After the first plane hit, I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the south tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
And there was much worse to come.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
Hundreds of people trapped in the World Trade Center desperately signaled for help.
The building was shaking, then I saw chunks of debris just falling down because I was close to the window. It was unbelievable.
But for most, there was no way out. The huge towers collapsed, one after the other, captured live on American television.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed. There is panic on the streets, thousands of people running up Church Street, which is what I'm looking out on.
Back and forth. We are continually trying.
As pandemonium gripped Manhattan, Washington came under attack. Another airliner was crashed into the Pentagon. Around the same time, a 4th aircraft came down in Pennsylvania. As government buildings were evacuated, the president, diverted from a return to Washington for security reasons, said his country was reeling from a national tragedy.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Just how many people have died from the coordinated assaults on the symbols of American business and government will not be known for some time. But it is confirmed that 156 people were on the 2 aircraft that were crashed into the World Trade Center. Paul Lockyer, ABC News.
The ABC's Prue Clark lives in New York, a few blocks from the World Trade Center. I spoke to her earlier as she described the scenes on New York streets.
I just heard on the radio that there'd been an incident. That was at about 10 to 9. I was on my way to work. I walked outside and looked at the building, which is about 15 blocks south of my house, and there was the gaping great hole, as you've seen. I couldn't believe it. People around me couldn't believe it. A lot of people were sort of walking towards the World Trade Center, which I did too. A lot of people were in shock and kind of screaming. They obviously knew people inside the building. But coming the other way were the evacuees, who were all in a terrible state. They were crying. And at that point, as I was walking down, it was perhaps 8 blocks of the second plane hit, and I only knew that because I was listening to the radio, and I didn't actually even hear it, which was extraordinary to me. And then just kept walking. There was sort of no police action at that point, not much control, and they let me come right up close, about a block away from the World Trade Center. There was debris and glass everywhere, all over the cars. Only a few police. And there were a few people standing there, and the police kind of moved us on, and I'm terribly glad they did, because we were, perhaps no more than 3 blocks north of the World Trade Center when the South building collapsed.
And can you tell me what that was like, Prue?
It was absolutely horrifying. There was a roar, and then the building just began to disappear as it sort of imploded, I think. And people were in shock. They were screaming and running up the street. There was a stampede. We really thought we were going to die on that street, I think. And this massive plume of debris and dirt rushed up the street towards us, and sort of overcame a lot of us. And then we were perhaps 8 blocks away, and when that all sort of subsided, and we turned around and just looked at the building, and that was when people started to realize that many people were jumping from the north building of the World Trade Center, from the 85th floor. A lot of them were alight as they fell, but most of them were just jumping to escape the flames, I assume.
Prue, this event happened about 7 hours ago. Is there any indication yet of the death toll?
There's no indication whatsoever. The emergency services have just refused to answer that question. Rudy Giuliani, the mayor, has done the same. I mean, they appreciate they're talking thousands. They say that there are about 20,000 people in the building, probably at that point in time. But, it was an hour between when the first plane hit and when the South building collapsed. So presumably a lot of people would have got out in that time, and I have heard stories, many people that I know actually who got out in that time. But I have heard as well that during the World Trade Center bombing, and remember these buildings are 110 stories high, the World Trade Center bombing, they started evacuating people at 10 o'clock, and they were still coming out at 6 o'clock that night. So a lot of people wouldn't have escaped, and the buildings surrounding that as well, I would think, when the 2 main buildings collapsed, would have taken a fair bit of force as well. And we're sort of being moved along at the moment. There's a fire in a building next door to where the World Trade Center towers were, and a lot of people speculating that one might be about to fall.
Prue,
but the most alarming thing, I think, is that we've seen hundreds of ambulances go in and very few ambulances come out at this point.
How are people on the street reacting?
Well, at the time it was just total disbelief. We were standing there watching people coming out, jumping out of the building, and people were sighing and in shock and screaming and terrified, and also people coming out of the subways because they were afraid that that was just the beginning and that subways might be the next point of attack. But it's now 7 hours, as you said, and people are sort of calming down. These are New Yorkers after all, and while this is extraordinary, they do sort of take life in its stride, and they just 10 blocks north of the disaster area, people are sitting in cafes and having lunch. I had heard too, as I'm walking around, a few sort of anti-Arab calls as well. I don't know if that's a reflection of a broader sentiment in the point.
New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani has declared a state of emergency as the city tries to cope with the size of the disaster. The city has called in all off-duty medical personnel and has appealed for more ambulances from surrounding New York State. In an interview Mr. Giuliani recorded earlier with CNN, he expressed grave fears for the number of casualties among the city's emergency services workers.
A large number of police, fire, EMS personnel have also been injured in this. Can you shed any light on that?
I don't even want to contemplate what the number will be. But when the building collapsed, we had a lot of our police officers and firefighters in the building, and I know many of them because I saw some of them go in because I was there, and I'm praying for them. I just hope they're able to get out. I never thought I would see something like this happen. I got there after the first plane hit and before the second, and watching people jump from the top of the World Trade Center is an unbelievable sight.
It's a horrific day, Mr. Mayor.
There's no possible way to begin to describe it.
No, there is not.
To see what happened there is, of course, it makes you very, very angry. It's almost impossible to describe the level of anger that you have that somebody or someone would do something like this. There's no reason for this. There's no excuse for this. And there's something like this is just something you never thought you would live to see.
The Prime Minister John Howard was in Washington when the attacks occurred. He said the images would stay with him forever, and he expressed sorrow that any country could be attacked in such a cowardly way.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, could I start this news conference by reading a message that I sent a few moments ago to President Bush. Dear Mr. President, the Australian government and people share the sense of horror. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a very tragic day in the history of a great nation. Words always do fail you on an occasion like this, but the sense of horror I know is shared by all Australians here in Washington, and I know will be shared by our fellow countrymen and women back home. I had the opportunity a few moments ago to personally express my feelings to Tom Schaefer, the American ambassador in the United States, who's accompanied me here on my visit. I can only hope, as I know all decent people around the world will, that those responsible for this despicable series of attacks upon the United States will be hunted down and meted out the justice that they so much deserve. The full extent of casualties, of course, is unknown, and I'm no more able to offer a view on that than any of you. Can I say that I've spoken to the Acting Prime Minister, John Anderson, earlier this morning after these events took place, and already arrangements, a number of appropriate arrangements have been made, particularly in relation to United States assets and installations in Australia. We have, amongst other things, the Australian Federal Police have established an exclusion zone around the United States Embassy in Canberra. Heightened security has been established for United States consulates in Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. There's been additional close personal security provided for the American Chargé. We have also increased, ASIO has increased surveillance of and protection, and has arranged for additional protection in relation to Israeli and Jewish assets in Australia. At 1:30 this morning, Australian time, there was a special meeting chaired by the Protective Security Coordinator involving the Department of the Attorney General, the Defence and ASIO. ASIO, of course, is continuing to provide assessments. In other words, all the appropriate responses are being undertaken in Australia, both in relation to American assets and also having regard to obvious tensions in relation to Israeli and Jewish assets in our country. I think the only other thing I can say to you is really on behalf of all the Australians here is to say to our American friends whom we love and admire so much, we really feel for you. It is a terrible day. It's a day that recalls the words used by President Roosevelt in 1940. It's a day of infamy, that an attack of this kind can be made in such an indiscriminate fashion, not upon military assets, as was the case in Pearl Harbor, but upon innocent civilians, men, women, children going about their daily lives. And as I say, words aren't very adequate, but they are a sign that we feel for our American friends. We will stand by them, we will help them, we will support actions they take to properly retaliate in relation to these acts of bastardry against their citizens and against what they stand for. America has been hurt by today's events, but the American spirit will not be daunted or bowed or diminished by these events. The resolution of the American people will be evident, and they will respond in accordance with the courageous traditions of their country.
Our political correspondent, Jim Middleton, is travelling with the Prime Minister, and Jim joins us now from Washington. Jim, we understand one of the missing aircraft was a feeder flight to a Qantas connection. Can you update us on this?
What we do know is this, and it was first revealed by the Prime Minister at his news conference, of which we just saw a snippet then, that the American Airlines Flight 75, which was flying from Dulles Airport outside Washington to Los Angeles, was designed to connect to a Qantas flight. Now, I'm told that on board were 6 people who had bought Qantas tickets, and there was also a Qantas staffer on his or her way back to Australia. Now, American Airlines Flight 75 is the one which we believe crashed into the Pentagon, and so it is possible that up to 7, or at least 7, Australians or people with Australian connections may well have perished in that terrible inferno.
Has the Prime Minister commented on that, and where is he at this moment?
Well, the Prime Minister did comment basically to remind us that this was apparently a feeder flight to a Qantas plane. The Prime Minister was giving a news conference on the Tampa crisis at the very time the Pentagon was struck by the airliner.
Jim, I'm sorry, we have to interrupt you now. We're crossing live to Israel, where Foreign Minister Shimon Peres is giving a news conference.
מבחינתם, באופן חד צדדי, לרשות הפלסטינית, זה המסר ששמעון פרס העביר. עד כאן יעקב.
Against our common values. The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life. I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil. At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people. Our hearts are with you, and we are ready to provide any assistance at any time. The government of Israel has declared a day of mourning tomorrow as we bow our heads and share in the sorrow of the American people. טוב, תודה רבה לכם.
That was, of course, Ariel Sharon, Prime Minister of Israel, and we cross back to Washington and our political correspondent, Jim Middleton. Sorry to interrupt you there, Jim. You were saying that the Prime Minister was giving a news conference on the Tampa crisis. Is he still in the Australian Embassy now?
As I understand, well, what happened, Jane, was that immediately after the airliner slammed into the Pentagon, as there was chaos and not a little bit of panic in the streets outside, the Prime Minister was whisked away from his hotel, the Willard Hotel, which is about 3 blocks from the White House and probably about 5 kilometres from the Pentagon, up the street to the Australian Embassy into a secure area, and from there he began to coordinate the Australian response, as we heard from his news conference, talking to John Anderson and other members of the government to organise security arrangements, enhanced security back in Australia, and also to respond and to pass on his sympathy to the United States and to President Bush.
Strong response, obviously, is coming in from around the world, as we've just seen. Is there any more, though, that we know at this stage about the attack on the Pentagon itself?